The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. The video was produced based on the book The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck and other internet sources. Chapter 1, Don't Try. Charles Bukowski, an alcoholic and womanizer, is an unlikely source of life advice, yet his story is where Mark Manson begins. Bukowski's work was rejected for decades, leading him into alcohol-fueled depression. After a lifetime of failure, an editor took a chance on him, and Bukowski found success as a novelist and poet. Despite this, his tombstone reads, "Don't try." Bukowski's success stemmed from accepting himself as a failure and writing honestly about it. He didn't care about success, and fame didn't change him. Self-improvement and success often coincide, but they aren't the same. Our culture is obsessed with unrealistic positivity, but this fixation only reminds us of what we lack. A truly happy person doesn't need to affirm their happiness, they simply are. The world tells us that a better life comes from more possessions and achievements, leading us to give too many fucks about superficial things. However, giving too many fucks is detrimental to mental health. The key to a good life is caring less about more and focusing on what is true, immediate, and important. Mark Manson introduces the feedback loop from hell, where we become anxious about being anxious or angry about being angry. This loop is exacerbated by social media, where everyone seems to be having a great time, making us feel worse about our negative experiences. The solution is to not give a fuck about feeling bad, short-circuiting the loop. By accepting that the world is fucked, we stop hating ourselves for feeling bad. The desire for positive experience is a negative experience, while accepting negative experience is a positive one. The more we pursue feeling better, the less satisfied we become. Similarly, the more we want to be rich or sexy, the more poor or ugly we feel. Mark Manson says, don't try. Sometimes, caring less about something leads to better results. Pursuing the negative generates the positive. The pain in the gym leads to better health. Failures in business lead to success, and honest confrontation builds trust. Everything worthwhile in life is won through surmounting negative experiences. Avoiding suffering is a form of suffering, and denying failure is a failure. To not give a fuck is to face life's challenges and still take action. It means focusing on what truly matters: friends, family, and purpose. Mark Manson outlines 3 subtleties of not giving a fuck. First, it doesn't mean being indifferent, but being comfortable with being different. Second, to not give a fuck about adversity, you must care about something more important. Finally, whether we realize it or not, we are always choosing what to give a fuck about. As we mature, we become more selective about what we care about. In middle age, we accept ourselves and our limitations, reserving our fucks for the most important things. This simplification can lead to happiness. This story encourages readers to think more clearly about what they choose to find important and unimportant in life. It aims to reorient our expectations and help us realize that it's okay for things to suck sometimes. This understanding can lead to a kind of practical enlightenment, where we become comfortable with the inevitability of suffering and learn to bear it. Chapter 2, Happiness is a Problem. About 2,500 years ago, a king wanted to make his son's life perfect, shielding him from all suffering. Despite endless luxury, the prince grew dissatisfied because nothing seemed meaningful. He saw humans suffering outside the palace and blamed his father, deciding to live as a poor man. However, he found that suffering without purpose was also meaningless. The prince, later known as the Buddha, realized that life itself is a form of suffering, whether rich or poor, and we should accept it. A premise underlies many beliefs: happiness is algorithmic. If I achieve X, then I can be happy. However, this premise is the problem. Happiness is not a solvable equation. Dissatisfaction and unease are inherent parts of human nature and necessary components to creating consistent happiness. Mark Manson introduces Disappointment Panda, a superhero who tells harsh truths. He explains that suffering is biologically useful, inspiring change. We are wired to be dissatisfied, which drives innovation and survival. Pain, both physical and psychological, spurs action and teaches us to avoid mistakes. A society that avoids discomfort loses the benefits of experiencing healthy doses of pain. Problems never end, they just improve. Life is an endless series of problems, and solving one creates the next. Instead of hoping for a life without problems, hope for a life full of good problems. Happiness comes from solving problems. If you avoid problems or feel unable to solve them, you become miserable. The secret is in the solving, not in the absence of problems. Happiness is an action, not passively received. It's a constant work in progress, where solutions to today's problems lay the foundation for tomorrow's. True happiness occurs when you enjoy the problems you have and enjoy solving. People deny their problems or blame others because it's easier, but solving problems is hard. These quick highs are unproductive and can lead to addiction. Emotions evolve to help us live and reproduce better. They are feedback mechanisms, not commandments. Negative emotions signal unresolved problems and call for action, while positive emotions reward proper action. We shouldn't always trust our emotions, we should question them. Repressing negative emotions hinders problem solving, while over-identifying with emotions leads to poor decisions. Emotions are temporary, and a fixation on happiness leads to a never-ending pursuit of something else, leaving us feeling inadequate. This is the hedonic treadmill. The person you marry is the person you fight with. Everything has a sacrifice. Mark Manson asks, what pain do you want in your life? What are you willing to struggle for? This determines how our lives turn out. Most people want success, but not the hard work and sacrifices required. Happiness requires struggle and grows from problems. Real fulfillment is earned through choosing and managing our struggles. Whether it's anxiety, loneliness, or a bad boss, the solution lies in accepting and engaging with the negative experience, not avoiding it. People who enjoy the struggles of a gym are the ones who run triathlons. People who enjoy long work weeks in corporate politics are the ones who fly to the top. Mark Manson fantasized about being a rock star, but didn't love the process. He wanted the reward, not the struggle. Who you are is defined by what you're willing to struggle for. Our struggles determine our successes, and our problems birth our happiness. It's a never-ending upward spiral, and the joy is in the climb itself. Chapter 3, You Are Not Special. Mark Manson once knew a guy named Jimmy, who was always full of positivity and big ideas, but never followed through. Jimmy lived off his family's money and had a delusional level of self-confidence, believing he deserved success without working for it. This entitlement made him constantly seek validation and feel good about himself, even at the expense of others. In the 1960s, the idea of high self-esteem became popular, with the belief that it could lead to social benefits. However, data shows that simply feeling good about oneself without a good reason doesn't lead to success. Adversity and failure are necessary for developing strong-minded adults. Teaching people they're exceptional without merit leads to a population full of Jimmies, who are entitled and out of touch with reality. The problem with the self-esteem movement is that it measured self-esteem by how positively people felt about themselves. A true measure of self-worth is how people feel about the negative aspects of themselves. Entitled people like Jimmy delude themselves into believing they are accomplishing great things, even when they're not. They need to feel good all the time, which leads them to constantly think about themselves. Entitlement creates a narcissistic bubble, distorting everything to reinforce itself. People who feel entitled view every occurrence as either an affirmation or a threat to their greatness. However, entitlement is a failed strategy and not true happiness. The true measurement of self-worth is how a person feels about their negative experiences, not their positive ones. Mark Manson shares a personal story from adolescence when he was wrongly accused of bringing drugs to school. He was a rebellious kid who made some bad choices, including hiding marijuana in his backpack. This led to serious consequences, including expulsion from school and family issues. This experience led Mark Manson down a path of entitlement that lasted through much of his early adulthood. He became a player in relationships, seeking validation and overindulging in harmful behaviors. The deeper the pain, the more entitlement we adopt to compensate for our problems. This can manifest as either believing we are superior and deserve special treatment, or believing we are inferior and also deserve special treatment. Mark Manson argues that there's no such thing as a personal problem, as millions of others have likely experienced similar issues. The realization that you're not special in your suffering is the first step towards solving your problems. However, technology and social media may be contributing to a rise in entitlement, as people become more insecure and seek validation online. Most of us are average at most things, but the media often focuses on the extremes, leading us to believe that exceptionalism is the new normal. This can drive insecurity and desperation, causing us to compensate through entitlement and addiction. Technology has solved economic problems but created new psychological ones, such as open-sourcing insecurity and self-doubt. Mark Manson questions the cultural belief that we are all destined for something extraordinary. Being average has become the new standard of failure, leading some to seek attention by being the most miserable or victimized. However, accepting mediocrity doesn't mean we won't achieve anything. True greatness comes from an obsession with improvement, stemming from the belief that we are not already great. The idea that everyone can be extraordinary is just ego-stroking. Emotional health comes from accepting the mundane truths of life, such as that our actions don't matter that much and that most of our lives will be boring. This acceptance frees us to accomplish what we truly wish to accomplish without judgment or lofty expectations. It allows us to appreciate life's basic experiences, such as friendship, creating something, helping others, and enjoying simple pleasures. Chapter 4: The Value of Suffering. In the closing months of 1944, after almost a decade of war, the tide was turning against Japan. Their economy was floundering, their military overstretched across half of Asia, and the territories they had won throughout the Pacific were now toppling like dominoes to U.S. forces. Defeat seemed inevitable. On December 26, 1944, Second Lieutenant Hiro Onoda of the Japanese Imperial Army was deployed to the small island of Lubang in the Philippines. His orders were to slow the United States' progress as much as possible, to stand and fight at all costs, and to never surrender. Both he and his commander knew it was essentially a suicide mission. Mark Manson explains that if suffering is inevitable, the question we should be asking is not, how do I stop suffering? But why am I suffering? For what purpose? Humans often choose to dedicate large portions of their lives to seemingly useless or destructive causes. On the surface, these causes make no sense. It's hard to imagine how Onoda could have been happy on that island for those 30 years, living off insects and rodents, sleeping in the dirt, murdering civilians decade after decade. Or why Suzuki trekked off to his own death, with no money, no companions, and no purpose other than to chase an imaginary yeti. Self-awareness is like an onion, according to Mark Manson. There are multiple layers to it, and the more you peel them back, the more likely you're going to start crying at inappropriate times. The third level is our personal values. Why do I consider this to be success-failure? How am I choosing to measure myself? By what standard am I judging myself and everyone around me? This level, which takes constant questioning and effort, is incredibly difficult to reach. But it's the most important, because our values determine the nature of our problems, and the nature of our problems determines the quality of our lives. If what we value is unhelpful, if what we consider success-failure is poorly chosen, then everything based upon those values, the thoughts, the emotions, the day-to-day feelings, will all be out of whack. Everything we think and feel about a situation ultimately comes back to how valuable we perceive it to be. Mark Manson shares the story of Dave Mustaine, a talented young guitarist who was kicked out of his band Metallica in 1983, just before they signed a record deal. Mustaine went on to form Megadeth, which sold over 25 million albums. However, Mustaine couldn't help but still consider himself a failure because Metallica sold over 180 million albums. The author explains that our values determine the metrics by which we measure ourselves and everyone else. If you want to change how you see your problems, you have to change what you value and/or how you measure failure success. Mark Manson says there are a handful of common values that create really poor problems for people, problems that can hardly be solved. Pleasure is great, but it's a horrible value to prioritize your life around. Research shows that people who focus their energy on superficial pleasures end up more anxious, more emotionally unstable, and more depressed. Pleasure is the most superficial form of life satisfaction, and therefore the easiest to obtain and the easiest to lose. The other issue with overvaluing material success is the danger of prioritizing it over other values, such as honesty, nonviolence, and compassion. It's far more helpful to assume that you're ignorant and don't know a whole lot. This keeps you unattached to superstitious or poorly informed beliefs and promotes a constant state of learning and growth. While there is something to be said for staying on the sunny side of life, the truth is, sometimes life sucks, and the healthiest thing you can do is admit it. Denying negative emotions leads to experiencing deeper and more prolonged negative emotions and to emotional dysfunction. Constant positivity is a form of avoidance, not a valid solution to life's problems. Problems which, by the way, if you're choosing the right values and metrics, should be invigorating you and motivating you. Good values are 1. Reality-based, 2. Socially constructive, and 3. Immediate and controllable. Bad values are 1. Superstitious, 2. Socially destructive, and 3. Not immediate or controllable. Good, healthy values are achieved internally. Something like creativity or humility can be experienced right now. You simply have to orient your mind in a certain way to experience it. Bad values are generally reliant on external events. Values are about prioritization. What are the values that you prioritize above everything else, and that therefore influence your decision-making more than anything else? When we choose better values, we are able to divert our fucks to something better, toward things that matter, things that improve the state of our well-being and that generate happiness, pleasure, and success as side effects. Chapter 5, You Are Always Choosing. In this story, Mark Manson explores the idea that we are always choosing how to respond to the events in our lives, whether we realize it or not. He illustrates this with the example of running a marathon, where the same physical act can be either a source of pride or a terrifying experience, depending on whether it was chosen freely or forced upon us. Often, the only difference between a problem being painful or powerful is the feeling that we chose it and are responsible for it. Mark Manson shares the story of William James, who overcame numerous health issues and personal setbacks to become the father of American psychology. James decided to take 100% responsibility for everything in his life for 1 year. This experiment led to his rebirth and all of his later accomplishments. This highlights the realization that we are responsible for everything in our lives, regardless of external circumstances. We always control how we interpret and respond to what happens to us. Mark Manson clarifies the distinction between responsibility and fault, noting that they often appear together but are not the same. Fault is past tense, resulting from choices already made, while responsibility is present tense, resulting from the choices we are currently making. For example, even if a newborn baby is left on your doorstep, not your fault, you are still responsible for choosing what to do. The author uses a personal anecdote about his first girlfriend cheating on him to illustrate how taking responsibility for our emotions can lead to personal growth. Initially, he blamed his ex for his misery, but he eventually realized that he was responsible for his own happiness. By taking this approach, he began to improve himself and choose better values. Mark Manson addresses the issue of victimhood, noting that social media has made it easier than ever to blame others and seek attention for perceived injustices. He cautions against victimhood chic, which distracts from real societal problems and can be addictive. Instead, he encourages readers to pick their battles carefully, empathize with others, and prioritize values of honesty and transparency. Mark Manson concludes by stating that change is as simple as choosing to give a fuck about something else. He acknowledges that this is not easy, as it can lead to feelings of uncertainty, failure, and rejection. However, these are necessary side effects of choosing to place our energy in more important and worthy areas. Chapter 6, You Are Wrong About Everything, But So Am I. 500 years ago, many people had wrong beliefs about the world. Similarly, as a child, Mark Manson also had many incorrect ideas. As he grew older, his beliefs changed, and he realized he was wrong about many things. Mark Manson hopes this continues because it means he is growing. Growth is a constant process of moving from wrong to less wrong. We should focus on reducing our mistakes rather than finding the ultimate, right answer. Our values are like scientific hypotheses, and our actions are the experiments that generate data in the form of emotions and thoughts. There is no perfect ideology, only what experience has shown to be right for each individual. Many people become obsessed with being right about their lives and fail to live them. It's easier to remain in a painful certainty than to test those beliefs and find out for sure. Beliefs that provide comfort now can mortgage greater happiness later. Certainty is the enemy of growth, and we should constantly seek doubt about our beliefs and feelings. Being wrong opens us to change and growth. We don't truly know what a positive or negative experience is, and we shouldn't trust our conceptions of them. Our brains create meaning by making associations between experiences. We assume the button caused the light to go on. Our minds constantly generate associations to help us understand and control our environment. However, the brain is imperfect, and we easily mistake or misinterpret things. Once we create meaning, our brains hold on to it, even when faced with contradictory evidence. Most of what we know is the product of inaccuracies and biases in our brains. Therefore, most of our beliefs are wrong, and it's important to accept this. In 1988, Meredith Marin falsely accused her father of sexual abuse, only to realize later that she had invented the memory. Our memories are unreliable and can be easily altered. We fill in gaps with our own embellishments and come to believe them. Our brains are biased toward what we already believe, and we interpret new information based on our existing values. Meredith's false memory arose from her strained relationship with her father, failed relationships with men, and exposure to stories of child abuse. Our minds prioritize coherence with past experiences and may invent false memories to maintain established meanings. Instead of trusting yourself, perhaps we should trust ourselves less and question our intentions more. If we are all wrong all the time, then self-skepticism is the only logical path to progress. This is not self-destructive, but liberating. Erin, a self-improvement junkie, was convinced she could cure death and needed Mark Manson's help. Her certainty refused to relinquish itself, even though it was irrational and unhealthy. Some of the worst criminals feel good about themselves and justify hurting others. Evil people believe everyone else is evil. Certainty is unattainable, and its pursuit breeds insecurity. The more you try to be certain, the more uncertain you will feel. Embrace uncertainty, and you will feel more comfortable with what you don't know. Uncertainty removes judgments and biases and relieves us of judging ourselves. It is the root of progress and growth. Our values are imperfect, and assuming they are perfect leads to entitlement and avoidance of responsibility. To solve our problems, we must admit that our actions and beliefs have been wrong. Mark Manson's law of avoidance states that the more something threatens your identity, the more you will avoid it. This applies to both good and bad things. People avoid opportunities that threaten their self-perception. Knowing yourself can be dangerous and limit your potential. Instead, never know who you are to keep striving and discovering. Buddhism suggests letting go of the idea of you and the arbitrary metrics by which you define yourself. This frees you to act, fail, and grow. When you let go of your self-absorbed fears, you realize that there is little unique or special about your problems. Don't be special or unique. Redefine your metrics in mundane ways. To be less certain of yourself, ask, what if I'm wrong? Question your thoughts and beliefs. What would it mean if I were wrong? Consider the potential meaning behind your wrongness. Would being wrong create a better or worse problem than my current problem, for both myself and others? Choose the problem that sustains healthy relationships built on trust and respect. If it feels like it's you versus the world, it's probably just you versus yourself. Chapter 7: Failure is the Way Forward. Mark Manson feels fortunate that he entered adulthood during the financial collapse of 2007, as it forced him to confront failure early on. Sleeping on a futon and struggling to find a job made starting a blog and an internet business less daunting. Failure is relative, it depends on one's metrics. Mark Manson grew up in a wealthy family, which taught him that money alone isn't a good measure of self-worth. Instead, he valued freedom and autonomy, choosing to pursue his own projects even if it meant being broke for a while. For him, the real failure would have been not pursuing his passions. Mark Manson introduces the failure-success paradox with a story about Pablo Picasso, who charged a woman $20,000 for a napkin drawing, explaining it took him over 60 years to draw it. Improvement comes from countless tiny failures, and success is based on how many times one has failed. Children learning to walk fall repeatedly, but don't give up. Avoiding failure is a learned behavior, often from the education system or critical parents. Fear of failure confines and stifles us. True success requires a willingness to fail. This fear often stems from choosing poor values, such as seeking external validation, which leads to anxiety. Better values are process-oriented, like expressing oneself honestly, which provides ongoing challenges and growth. Goals, as conventionally defined, have limited happiness potential. Picasso's success was due to his value of honest expression, making even a simple napkin drawing valuable. Kazimierz Dabrowski's study of World War II survivors revealed that many believed their traumatic experiences made them better, more grateful people. Pain often makes us stronger and more resilient. Dabrowski argued that fear, anxiety, and sadness are necessary for psychological growth, and denying that pain is denying our potential. Radical changes in perspective often occur after our worst moments, prompting us to question our values. Mark Manson emphasizes that pain is part of the process and must be felt to motivate change. Mark Manson uses the analogy of his parents struggling with a new VCR to illustrate how many people feel overwhelmed by certain life challenges. He shares examples of people asking seemingly simple questions, like how to drop out of med school or ask someone on a date, which feel impossibly complex due to the associated pain. The problem is that emotions define their reality, making it hard to separate feelings from facts. Many people try to numb their pain instead of sustaining it. When you choose a new value, you choose a new form of pain, which should be embraced. Life is about not knowing and doing something anyway. In 2008, Mark Manson quit his job to start an online business and felt overwhelmed. He recalled his math teacher's advice: if you're stuck on a problem, don't sit there and think about it, just start working on it. He learned that action isn't just the effect of motivation, but also the cause of it. The typical chain reaction is emotional inspiration leading to motivation and then action, but it's also an endless loop. By reorienting our mindset to action leading to inspiration and then motivation, we can overcome a lack of motivation. This is the do something principle. Tim Ferriss shared a story about a novelist who wrote over 70 novels by forcing himself to write 200 crappy words per day, which inspired him to write more. If we follow the do something principle, failure feels unimportant, and any result is seen as progress. Even during an existential crisis, the answer is to do something, even the smallest viable action. Chapter 8: The Importance of Saying No. In 2009, Mark Manson gathered his possessions, left his apartment, and set off for Latin America, planning to spend the next few years living abroad and building his business. He visited 55 countries, made friends, and had lovers, but realized that absolute freedom means nothing. Freedom grants the opportunity for greater meaning, but the only way to achieve meaning is through a rejection of alternatives, a narrowing of freedom, and a choice of commitment. In 2011, Mark Manson traveled to St. Petersburg, Russia, and despite the food, weather, and overpriced apartments, he loved it. He found a bluntness to Russian culture, where honesty and communication were without conditions. This experience taught him the ability to say whatever he thought or felt without fear of repercussion, a liberation through accepting rejection. Travel is a fantastic self-development tool because it extricates you from the values of your culture and shows you that another society can live with different values. Many people have been indoctrinated with the belief that they should try to be as inherently accepting and affirmative as possible, but we need to reject something. Otherwise, we stand for nothing. The avoidance of rejection gives us short-term pleasure, but makes us rudderless in the long term. To truly appreciate something, you must confine yourself to it. The act of choosing a value requires rejecting alternative values. We are defined by what we choose to reject, and if we reject nothing, we have no identity at all. Unhealthy love is based on two people trying to escape their problems through their emotions for each other, while healthy love is based on two people acknowledging and addressing their own problems with each other's support. The difference between a healthy and unhealthy relationship comes down to responsibility and the willingness to both reject and be rejected by their partner. People in a healthy relationship with strong boundaries will take responsibility for their own values and problems, and not take responsibility for their partner's values and problems. Without conflict, there can be no trust. Conflict exists to show us who is there for us unconditionally and who is just there for the benefits. For a relationship to be healthy, both people must be willing and able to both say no and hear no. Trust is the most important ingredient in any relationship, because without trust, the relationship doesn't actually mean anything. Consumer culture makes us want more, but more is not always better. We are often happier with less. When we're overloaded with options, we suffer from the paradox of choice. While investing deeply in one person, one place, one job, or one activity might deny us the breadth of experience we'd like, pursuing a breadth of experience denies us the opportunity to experience the rewards of depth of experience. Commitment gives you freedom, because you're no longer distracted by the unimportant and frivolous. Commitment makes decision-making easier and removes any fear of missing out. There is a freedom and liberation in commitment. Chapter 9, and then you die. That was the last thing Josh ever said to Mark Manson. He said it ironically, attempting to sound deep while simultaneously making fun of people who attempt to sound deep. He was drunk and high, and he was a good friend. The most transformational moment of Mark Manson's life occurred when he was 19 years old. His friend Josh had taken him to a party on a lake just north of Dallas, Texas. Shortly after arriving at the party, Josh and Mark sat in the pool together, drinking beers and talking as young angsty males do. Later in the evening, Josh and Mark got separated. As they walked up the hill, they bumped into Josh coming down. He smiled and said, "Seek the truth for yourself, and I will meet you there." Mark nodded and made a serious face. Josh laughed and walked down the hill toward the cliff. Mark laughed and continued up the hill toward the house. When the girl and Mark came out again, everyone was gone and there were sirens. It took scuba divers 3 hours to find Josh's body at the bottom of the lake. It took Mark 12 hours to let himself cry. I went into a deep depression that summer. Mark dreamed about Josh for a few months after that. In one of Mark's last dreams of Josh, he said something like, "Why do you care that I'm dead when you're still so afraid to live?" Mark woke up crying. It was sitting on Mark's mom's couch that summer, staring into the so-called abyss, seeing the endless and incomprehensible nothingness where Josh's friendship used to be, when he came to the startling realization that if there really is no reason to do anything, then there is also no reason to not do anything. That summer, Mark gave up the weed and the cigarettes and the video games. He gave up his silly rock star fantasies and dropped out of music school and signed up for college courses. He started going to the gym and lost a bunch of weight. Josh's death marks the clearest before, after point Mark can identify in his life. Oddly, it was someone else's death that gave him permission to finally live. And perhaps the worst moment of his life was also the most transformational. Ernest Becker was an academic outcast. Becker died in 1974. His book, The Denial of Death, would win the Pulitzer Prize and become one of the most influential intellectual works of the 20th century. The denial of death essentially makes 2 points. Humans are unique in that we're the only animals that can conceptualize and think about ourselves abstractly. This realization causes what Becker calls death terror, a deep existential anxiety that underlies everything we think or do. Becker's second point starts with the premise that we essentially have 2 selves. The first self is the physical self, the one that eats, sleeps, snores, and poops. The second self is our conceptual self, our identity, or how we see ourselves. Becker called such efforts our immortality projects, projects that allow our conceptual self to live on way past the point of our physical death. All of human civilization, he says, is basically a result of immortality projects. The cities and governments and structures and authorities in place today were all immortality projects of men and women who came before us. Becker later came to a startling realization on his deathbed, that people's immortality projects were actually the problem, not the solution, that rather than attempting to implement, often through lethal force, their conceptual self across the world, people should question their conceptual self and become more comfortable with the reality of their own death. Mark Manson steps from rock to rock, climbing steadily, leg muscles stretching and aching. Finally, he climbs over a small boulder, and the view opens up. Mark is at South Africa's Cape of Good Hope, once thought to be the southern tip of Africa and the southernmost point in the world. There's a saying in Portuguese, "Ele dobra o cabo de boa esperança." It means he's rounding the Cape of Good Hope. Ironically, it means that the person's life is in its final phase, that he's incapable of accomplishing anything more. The human body seems to come equipped with a natural radar for death-inducing situations. At 1 foot, you feel like you're floating. Anything but looking straight down feels as though you're part of the sky itself. You actually kind of expect to fall at this point. Confronting the reality of our own mortality is important because it obliterates all the crappy, fragile, superficial values in life. As Becker pointed out, this is arguably the only truly important question in our life. Without acknowledging the ever-present gaze of death, the superficial will appear important, and the important will appear superficial. Death is the only thing we can know with any certainty. And as such, it must be the compass by which we orient all of our other values and decisions. Looking back on that night, out by that lake, when Mark watched his friend Josh's body getting fished out of the lake by paramedics, he remembers staring into the black Texas night and watching his ego slowly dissolve into it. Josh's death taught Mark much more than he initially realized. Yes, it helped him to seize the day, to take responsibility for his choices, and to pursue his dreams with less shame and inhibition. But these were side effects of a deeper, more primary lesson. And the primary lesson was this: there is nothing to be afraid of. Ever.
Hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe.